back, everyone, to the Inside Texas YouTube channel powered by Inside Texas here on the Reheat. RT cannot be here, so I'm here to sub in with Joe Cook, who was pretty active at the SEC spring meetings last night, running around, annoying all the head coaches. So we're going to dive into that. But before we do so, make sure you're going over to InsideTexas.com and checking out our brand new summer sale, 50% off for the Ultimate Fan Bundle. Inside Texas, On 3 for your national news and rivals, all packed together for just this fun little bundle that you can go get over at Inside Texas. And it's a really good deal if you're looking for some Texas football, baseball, basketball, all the source information. Joe was feet on the ground in Destin, a lot of sand between those toes, but also some work, some reporting going on. So, Joe, you wrote an article last week, pretty much immediately after you had a chance to sit down and write about just how, there's not a lot of talk about football going on right now, which is a little different from last year. I mean, there was similar amounts of general college football talk, but what was the main topic of discussion in Destin, and what did it seem like most coaches were really focused on there?
Yeah, so last year, I think house settlement was the big topic, and it's like, how do we implement this? And then the 9-game thing, 8-game, 9-game thing was also important. But at this point, it was, I wrote in that article, like, we didn't even hear the words Arch Manning at all. And that's with Texas football coaches there. Every Texas site had somebody there. It's kind of interesting, like Alabama and Florida, I don't think they had anybody who covers their teams there. So a little bit of an interesting experience. And maybe that was an overestimation on my part, like the fact that, why aren't these outlets sending people? Well, because it's just procedural meetings. You really are not talking about very much on-field stuff. And if you are, well, maybe that means something happened in your off season. So a lot of it was just general, like, who is actually running this? Because, nobody really seems to have an understanding of some of the rules in college athletics. They had some guys from the NIL Go and College Sports Commission there, talk about cap and stuff like that. Just lots of, panic and stuff like that, basically. And then they had a lot of talk about the college football playoff. What format is the right format for the CFP? Sark's been very adamant about it. I think Mike Elko had a pretty good line. It's like, just make it 40. That way I make it every year. And, you can get what's it called? You can get John Harbaugh that way if you keep making it and you have, great rosters, but you don't advance. You run the risk of just making the playoff not being enough. But that's what a lot of it was. It was a lot of, what's the future of the college football playoff? And then what's the, just general alarm at the sport. And the college football playoff stuff, I think, is, for Texas fans, what's on top of mind for everybody when it comes to the most important stuff from that meeting.
Yeah, listen, you shouted out John Harbaugh. He didn't even make the playoff 10 this last year. Shout out Mike Tomlin for doing so and still getting fired anyway. Thank you for not rubbing it in too much. But yeah, it felt like more than ever the discussion points, and this has been echoed throughout all of these meetings from the Big Ten to the ACC to the Big 12. Just what's wrong with our sport and what can we do to fix it? And a lot of coaches are taking this chance to say what they feel is necessary. And there's obviously a hierarchy going on where certain coaches couldn't really care less about the playoff because they feel like their teams are always going to be good enough to be in the playoff. And then Elko, who's kind of in that middle ground of like, yeah, however many you won, my team's going to be good, but I'll definitely make it every single year if it's 24 or, even more than that, which God forbid. There was obviously some Texas football talk, Joe, and I know you talked about a little bit on Inside Texas, some transfer additions, but what was Sark saying about the actual team past just, here's how I feel about the playoff and rules and things like that?
Yeah, I'm going to keep it on the playoff real quick because I think, and I'll get to that. He talked up Bo Masco and Sterling Burkhalter, but with the playoff thing, Sark has kind of been the loudest complainer or the loudest voice about this because his team was affected and he's the most high profile brand. Clark Lee kind of has a similar gripe. Vanderbilt went 10-2. They lost to Texas, but they didn't make the playoff. And the big gripe is how much does strength of schedule matter? Because as we know, Sark had the whole, we could beat Texas Tech's schedule with our 2s and 3s comments because Texas is going to play a schedule where the average opponent is tougher than Texas Tech's toughest opponent. And so the big deal with the playoff was they had the executive director there and they wanted to know, hey, how much does strength of schedule really factor in? Because 9-3 and the playing Texas schedule is a lot different than 9-3 playing Al's schedule. And from all the reporting that I was able to do, from some other ones from places like Sports Illustrated, it didn't really sound like they got a good answer. They were basically, said it's a tool, but nothing. There was nothing there that really dispelled them from thinking that 10 wins was what they had to do no matter what. And it was interesting that Trev Alberts, who's Texas A&M's offensive or athletic director, and then Brent Venables, the Oklahoma head coach, they were basically saying stuff like, hey, we want to know this too. They weren't trying to take shots at Texas. They know very well that if they go 9-3, they could be in this similar situation, just wondering like, whoa, we played a tougher schedule. We played 9 SEC games. We played a power conference opponent. And, if we go 9-3, that is orders of magnitude more difficult than other schedules. And yet those other schedules are still being rewarded just because they have 10. And I'm one of the people who think that like if 9-3 compared to 10-2, you should be able to make up a win's worth of difference or a loss's worth of difference with strength of schedule stuff. It's a lot harder for me to think that when it's like 11-1 versus 9-3, especially if it's Power 5 or Power 4 teams. I know it's not perfect, but it's harder for me to see like, look, this is 2 wins right here, even if it is an easier schedule. But the thing is, they just don't know what the one is because they have no clue what else to do aside from win 10 games, and they made everybody's schedule harder this year. So that was the big thing. As far as the actual team goes, he said he was asked about pleasant surprises from the transfer portal. And on offense, he said Sterling Burkhalter. And in defense, he said Bo Masco. With Masco, it's because, look, this guy can play corner. He can play nickel. I looked up his PFF stats against Ohio State, and it stinks because Jeremiah Smith was out that game. So he only had to go against Carnell Tate and Brandon Ennis. But he had a great game then, and he can play a little bit. And maybe he gives you the opportunity to move Grayson Littleton outside, or you keep Grayson Littleton inside and use Bo Masco outside. And then with Burkhalter, everybody's kind of hooked on the Cam Coleman, Ryan Wingo, Emmett Mosley dynamic. And then obviously Dalen McCutcheon is someone who has some good experience there and played a lot last year. But Burkhalter was someone who is tall, has some good change of direction, and Sark probably didn't think he would get maybe an explosive athlete at that spot in the transfer portal. And, there's going to be some tough competition. You've got young players like redshirt freshman Kalik Lockett and true freshman Jermaine Bishop who are going to contend. But, maybe Burkhalter plays a role, a Tariq Milton type role if they ever get that far down. And but all in all, that just elevating the foundation of that wide receiver room.
That kind of idea of the veteran from a lower program has helped teams in multiple sports, from football, baseball, basketball, all around. Kind of surprising teams where it's like we didn't really know what we were going to get from this guy who was pretty low value just because it was his last year of eligibility. But when push comes to shove, when he had to be on the field, he was a productive player, and that seems to be the kind of player that Sterling Burkhalter can be for Texas. We're going to hear a quick word from David McClellan before we keep moving and talking about Sark at Destin.
Big financial decisions don't have to feel overwhelming. There's someone who can guide you every step of the way. David McClellan is a fiduciary financial advisor with Forum Financial, and he's working closely with his clients as a true financial life coach, guiding every aspect of your financial journey with expertise and care. If his name sounds familiar, that's because David was a swimmer at Texas and a member of several national championship teams. Today, he channels that same championship mindset into helping people win with their finances. David specializes in financial planning, and he's contributed numerous articles to Kiplinger on the topic of retirement tax bombs. And right now, David is offering viewers a free intro consultation to assess your financial situation. Do not miss this chance to get personalized guidance from a trusted expert. To schedule your free consult, email David at dmcclellan@forumfinancial.com, or you can call him directly at 312-933-8823. The contact info is in the description.
Joe, I feel like the last week or two between, Brandon Harris talked to Adrian Wojnarowski and Sark, both in Destin and at the Touchdown Club, and even our own Paul Wadlington over at Inside Texas has just done a lot of talk about roster building and what it means in the current era to actually use the transfer portal and allocate your funds the correct way and find the right balance between homegrown players and plucking from somewhere else around the country. What did you take away when Sark was asked about how he's trying to build his roster and also just how it was different from last year's team compared to this year's one?
Yeah, in the past, and I think Sark prefers this, he wants to be a primarily high school recruiting built program. Not only, getting the right mix of instant impact guys, but also the guys who, decide to stay for 2 or 3 years and, or 4 years and become better players when they're 21 and 22 instead of when they're 18. That's, a lot that means that you have to nail your evaluations. And when you go to the portal, yeah, you could be getting a best player available, and that's what they've obviously done with someone like Cam Coleman. But sometimes you're fixing some developments and other aspects of your roster that weren't as strong as you want them to be. I think we saw that play out in the offensive line. And that means, even at a place like Texas where you do have a lot of money, you have to be smart about where you direct those funds. And the question was like, do you really – I don't know if I phrased it the right way, but it was like, do you think that, what we think of as like a highly ranked recruiting class, is that something, amassing that type of talent, really a big deal for you, or is it just building the whole roster? And Sark, understands, yeah, you've got to have, and I think he answered a question you asked him in like December about this. It's like, you got to get like the first round guys. It's a draft. Even the lower ranked guys in your class, a couple who I wrote about today, you want them to succeed and do well in your program. It just may take a little bit longer. But he understands that you've got to go get players from high school. If they're good and you hit on them, you got to keep them. And if you need some more, whether it be instant impact guys or just refilling the roster, you go to the portal. So I think he understands you need a balanced look. Sometimes one piece of the pie is going to be a little bit bigger, but I don't think he wants to lean all the way into one area, all the way into the other. He views it as roster building, not recruiting and portal. And I think that's something that, if you're able to do it that way, then that may be one of the better ways to do it in college football.
I think also that tier-based system that you were noting there it does work the same way for recruiting and with the transfer portal, because when you're recruiting these guys at the very top, your tier one guys, your Arch Mannings, and end up being, Jermaine Bishop or Tyler Atkinson, you're recruiting them to be able to play year one anyway. Like, maybe you don't want them to be forced to start, but some guys like Colin Simmons are just going to be good enough to get on the field and go play. That's the same thing you're doing in the transfer portal. It's just a little more direct. They are going to be physically starting. Cam Coleman and Hollywood Smothers or Raleek Brown are going to be starting for Texas. But it's the same effort that you need 3 stars in the recruiting that you need your 3-star types in the portal. And that's Sterling Burkhalter, who we just talked about before the break. And that's also some of these players who are going to be there for a few years. I think of Jonte Newman on the offensive line, who, they're bringing him in as not a high-level guy. Not a lot of people are going to talk about him for the next year, but Sark believes it's the same thing as bringing in a high school tackle, and maybe even a more economically important way of doing it, because a high school tackle takes an extra year and he might be more expensive because he sees that what's next to him on the On3 or Rivals rankings, and that's what he believes his value is. So I like the way that Sark's talked about it a lot. I think that's been his most Texas football specific talking point in the past few months, outside of just like, hey, here's some players that I like. So we got a lot from him in Destin, not a ton of football as we talked about, but were there any other things, Joe, that really stuck out to you, or any last thoughts about, what other coaches were saying around the league?
I think Kirby, when they were talking about does the SEC want to break away, Kirby Smart said something like, look, I've talked with my school president about that, and that's no small deal, because I think for as much as people like to joke about Georgia, like Georgia, the school is very, very academically focused and on a similar, plane and thinking like Texas. So doing something like that, choosing a new association, it would be a big deal. But Kirby is also like, look, I don't want to be the one that ruins college sports, because if the SEC just breaks away for football, that's a whole different thing. And if the SEC just breaks away, then you have to manage all the different sports. And one thing the NCAA is really good at is hosting a tournament, and they run 2 of the biggest ones, 3 of the biggest ones in the whole world, and get multi-billion dollars worth of television revenue from it. So there are a lot of problems with the idea of the SEC breaking away. The other thing was that bill was introduced in the Senate on Wednesday, I believe. And so Greg Sankey and some other people had the chance to respond to it. Not a whole lot of response, but I think as we saw, there was on Thursday, they released a statement saying, like, look, this aspect about pooling media rights, we're not interested. That's going to be that should have been obvious to everybody when the SEC or the Big Ten's giving out about $1 billion worth of revenue, and the SEC is probably going to give out $1 billion worth of revenue to its schools next year. They don't want to have that eaten into. They want to keep that all to themselves. So I do think there were a lot of good parts to that bill. I think everybody in the SEC thinks that too. But one thing I also noticed was I think Greg Sankey took some hits this week. One thing I've been, Greg Sankey is kind of like Roger Goodell. He is not the one formulating these opinions. He's the one working for the owners, working for the school presidents and ADs, and filtering out what they want, and he's the guy for it. And usually he's had like the bully pulpit. When the SEC is winning title after title after title, you can come in and claim like, oh, we're the strongest, we're the best, all that stuff. He's still doing that, but the SEC keeps getting beat by the Big Ten in the playoff, and they keep, failing to play for the national championship. So I think maybe his image took a little bit of a ding. I think he's still really good at expressing the points he wants to express and addressing what he wants to address. I think he's a really good public speaker, but some of the things that he's been saying don't have the same weight that they used to, even when he claims stuff like, well, look at what the NFL draft says, and look at, we have metrics from the CFP telling us that we are the, toughest conference, and we are a super conference, a super league. Well, I mean, it's hard to really, really buy that 100% unless you're bringing home the national championship trophy, and that hadn't happened since 2022.
I think there's clearly some points that Sankey makes that behind closed doors, a lot of higher up people in college football would agree with. NFL draft picks and talent do matter, and the SEC is bringing out teams that are a little bit better just on the average playing ground, but they don't have the best teams in the sport anymore. And that's at the end of the day, that's all people really care about. Who's winning the championship? Who's going to be in the top 3 and 4? And if it's not Georgia, Alabama, or, now potentially Texas, he doesn't have the same weight in his speech and what he's saying and the rhetoric around it as he once did. So, Sankey's taken some hits publicly. He's taken some hits when it comes to playoff and navigating schedules and things like that in the SEC. But, this is a big year for the conference where Texas at the forefront of that, and Georgia as well. They can kind of reclaim that identity as the top dog, as just with one championship if the playoffs don't change and if they're still sticking to that 12 team or even 16, which is what I think the SEC would prefer to go to. I think that's going to do it for us over on the Inside Texas YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us on the live. 300 pairs of eyeballs are here. Make sure you're going over to the InsideTexas.com summer sale. 50% off the Ultimate Fan Bundle. Gets you Inside Texas for all of your Texas sports needs. On 3 for national news and Rivals for recruiting. Recruiting is really heating up in the month of June. You're reading a lot about it on Inside Texas. So make sure you're checking that out. And Joe, thank you as always for coming on. We'll see you guys next week on the Reheat.